You watch others effortlessly build networks that open doors, while your best efforts at connection fall flat and leave you feeling isolated. Every networking event feels like an uphill battle where you struggle to make meaningful connections, while others seem to naturally attract opportunities and support through their relationships. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature to discover why some people magnetize others while most remain invisible in a crowd of faces. What I learned about transforming relationships will revolutionize how you connect with people, turning every interaction into an opportunity for mutual growth and success. The same principles that helped millions build careers, save marriages, and create lasting friendships can transform your life from lonely struggle to abundant connection. But first, like this video, subscribe for more relationship wisdom that actually works, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for genuine human connection has spread across our world. Let me take you back to a small farm in Missouri where a painfully shy boy named Dale Carnegie spent his childhood feeling like an outsider in his own world. That boy was me, and I can still remember the crushing weight of social awkwardness that followed me everywhere I went. I grew up in poverty on our family farm, wearing patched clothes and feeling the sting of embarrassment every time I had to interact with other children. My shoes had holes, my pants were too short, and my self-consciousness about our financial situation made every social interaction feel like a minefield. I would rather feed the pigs and milk the cows than face the judgment I imagined in every human encounter. The first time I had to speak in front of my one-room schoolhouse, I stood frozen at the front of the class, my mouth dry as cotton, my hands trembling like autumn leaves. The words I had practiced so carefully in the barn simply evaporated. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears while 20 pairs of eyes stared at me in uncomfortable silence. When I finally managed to croak out a few sentences, my voice cracked and my face burned with humiliation. That night, I made a vow in my childhood diary that would change everything. I wrote these words: "I will learn to talk to people or die trying." At the time, it felt like those might be my only two options. My father saw my struggle and scraped together enough money to send me to State Teachers College in Warrensburg. But even there, I remained the awkward farm boy who felt like everyone could see right through my attempts to fit in. I joined the debate team thinking it would force me to overcome my fears, but my first debate was such a disaster that I considered dropping out of school entirely. I was failing at the most basic human skill, connection. While my classmates seemed to effortlessly make friends and build relationships, I analyzed every interaction afterward, wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have said differently, why people didn't seem drawn to me the way they were to others. But it was in those moments of deepest failure that I made a crucial observation. The students who were most popular, most successful, most respected, they weren't necessarily the smartest or the most talented. They were the ones who had mastered something I had completely missed: the art of making other people feel good about themselves. I began studying these natural connectors like a scientist studying a new species. I watched how they listened, how they spoke, how they made others light up in their presence. I started keeping detailed notes about what worked and what didn't in human interactions. I practiced conversations with farm animals before attempting them with humans. Slowly, painfully, through thousands of small experiments and countless failures, I began to understand that relationships weren't mysterious magic. They were skills that could be learned, techniques that could be mastered, principles that could be applied by anyone willing to put in the effort. My transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of dedicated study, practice, and refinement. But eventually, the shy farm boy who once trembled at the thought of speaking to another person became someone who could stand before thousands and help them transform their own lives through better relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. My greatest weakness had become my greatest strength. My profound failure at human connection had forced me to study it so intensely that I discovered principles most people never learn. The very inadequacy that once humiliated me had become the foundation for helping millions of others overcome their own relationship struggles. That childhood diary, with its desperate vow written in shaky handwriting, became the first page in what would become a lifetime dedicated to proving that anyone, no matter how shy, how awkward, how socially inadequate they feel, can learn to build meaningful relationships that transform their entire life. The farm boy who once hid from human connection had discovered that relationship mastery wasn't a gift you were born with. It was a skill you could develop. During my years of studying what made some people magnetic while others remained invisible, I stumbled upon a discovery that would revolutionize everything I thought I knew about human nature. It happened during my research into the most successful leaders in American history, and it centered around one man whose relationship mastery had literally held a nation together, Abraham Lincoln. I was poring over Lincoln's personal correspondence in the Library of Congress when I noticed something extraordinary. Letter after letter showed the same pattern. Lincoln had an almost supernatural ability to make people feel genuinely appreciated for who they were and what they contributed. Not hollow flattery or political maneuvering, but authentic recognition that seemed to reach into people's souls and affirm their worth. I found a letter Lincoln wrote to General Ulysses Grant during the darkest days of the Civil War. Instead of criticism for the mounting casualties, Lincoln wrote, "I wish to express my entire satisfaction with what you have done up to this time, so far as I understand it. The particulars of your plans I neither know nor seek to know. You are vigilant and self-reliant. And, pleased with this, I wish not to obtrude any constraints or restraints upon you." That letter revealed something profound about human psychology that most people completely miss. Lincoln understood that people will move mountains for someone who genuinely appreciates their efforts, their character, their unique contributions. Grant, who had been criticized by politicians and press alike, received from Lincoln something more powerful than orders or strategy. He received recognition of his worth as a person and a leader. I began studying this pattern in every successful relationship I could find. Charles Schwab, who built the steel industry, told me personally that he paid his executives more for their ability to work with people than for their technical knowledge. When I asked him his secret, he said something that became the cornerstone of my entire philosophy. I have yet to find the man, however exalted his station, who did not do better work and put forth greater effort under a spirit of approval than under a spirit of criticism. The revelation hit me like lightning. Human beings have a hunger for appreciation that goes deeper than their need for food or shelter. We crave recognition for our efforts, acknowledgement of our worth, validation that we matter in this vast universe. Yet most people go through entire days, weeks, even years, without receiving genuine appreciation from anyone. I conducted an experiment with myself. For 1 month, I made it my mission to find something genuinely praiseworthy in every person I encountered and express it honestly. The results were astounding. Store clerks smiled brighter, colleagues worked harder, strangers opened up and shared their deepest concerns. I was witnessing the magical transformation that occurs when you feed a starving soul. But I had to learn the critical distinction between appreciation and flattery. Flattery is shallow, insincere, and manipulative. People can sense it immediately, and it destroys trust. Appreciation is specific, genuine, and focused on character or effort rather than results. Flattery says, "You're amazing." Appreciation says, "I noticed how patiently you handled that difficult customer, and your kindness really made a difference in his day." I realize that most people are appreciation-starved because we're trained from childhood to notice what's wrong rather than what's right. We point out mistakes, criticize flaws, and offer suggestions for improvement, but we rarely pause to acknowledge what people are doing well. This creates a world full of individuals desperately craving validation, but rarely receiving it. Psychological principle behind this is simple but profound. People will literally transform themselves to become worthy of appreciation they've received. When you genuinely appreciate someone's character or effort, you're not just acknowledging what they've done, you're reinforcing who they can become. I watched this principle work miracles in the most unlikely situations. A chronically late employee became punctual when his manager appreciated the quality of his work. A rebellious teenager began cooperating when her teacher praised her creativity instead of criticizing her disruption. A struggling marriage was saved when both spouses began appreciating each other's efforts instead of focusing on their failures. Lincoln's letters revealed the ultimate secret. When you make people feel appreciated for their authentic selves, they don't just like you, they become inspired to live up to the best version of themselves. This isn't manipulation. It's the highest form of human encouragement. The great discovery wasn't that people need to be praised. It was that people need to be seen, valued, and appreciated for who they truly are. When you master this principle, you don't just build better relationships, you become a catalyst for bringing out the best in every person you encounter. This single insight transformed not only how I connected with others, but how I understood the very essence of human motivation and the foundation of all meaningful relationships. I learned one of the most powerful relationship secrets from studying a man who never forgot a name in his life, Theodore Roosevelt. When I examined his personal notebooks, I discovered a systematic approach to remembering names that helped him build the political alliances that shaped America. Roosevelt kept detailed records of everyone he met, their names, their families, their interests, their concerns. But more than that, he understood something most people miss entirely. A person's name is the sweetest and most important sound in any language to that person. When you remember someone's name, you're telling them they matter enough to occupy space in your memory. I witnessed this principle in action during my own career when I began teaching public speaking courses. In my first class, I made the mistake that most instructors make. I focused so intensely on the curriculum that I barely learned my students' names. The result was a room full of people who felt like anonymous faces in a crowd. But when I began making name memorization, my first priority, everything changed. I developed what I call the Roosevelt method for remembering names. The moment someone introduces themselves, I repeat their name immediately. Nice to meet you, Sarah. Then I use their name naturally throughout our conversation. I associate their name with something memorable about their appearance or personality. Most importantly, I write their name down as soon as possible, along with details about our conversation. The transformation was immediate and profound. When I greeted students by name in subsequent classes, I could see their faces light up. They sat straighter, participated more actively, and formed stronger connections not just with me, but with each other. By remembering their names, I had made them feel valued as individuals rather than anonymous members of a group. But the real magic happens in business relationships. I once watched a traveling salesman transform his entire career by implementing this single principle. He had been struggling to build client relationships until he began keeping a detailed card file of every customer's name, family details, hobbies, and preferences. Within 6 months, his sales doubled because clients felt personally known rather than just professionally serviced. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When someone remembers your name, especially after a significant period has passed, it triggers a cascade of positive emotions. You feel recognized, important, memorable. Your self-esteem gets a subtle but meaningful boost. You're more likely to trust that person, listen to their ideas, and want to help them succeed. I've seen business deals saved, friendships formed, and conflicts resolved simply because someone took the time to remember and use a person's name correctly. Conversely, I've watched promising relationships deteriorate because someone consistently forgot or mispronounced another person's name. The message sent is clear. You're not important enough for me to remember. Roosevelt understood this so deeply that he made name memorization a political strategy. He could meet hundreds of people at a single event and greet many of them by name weeks later. This wasn't just impressive. It was politically powerful. People felt personally connected to a man who obviously valued them enough to remember who they were. The technique requires discipline but delivers extraordinary results. When you meet someone new, focus completely on their name during the introduction. Ask them to repeat it if necessary. Use it 3 times during your first conversation. If it's unusual, ask about its origin or meaning. People love talking about their names. Write it down immediately after the conversation along with any personal details they shared. But here's the crucial element most people miss. You must genuinely care about remembering. If you're just going through the motions without authentic interest in the person, the technique becomes mechanical and loses its power. The goal isn't to impress people with your memory. It's to honor them by treating them as individuals worthy of being remembered. I've made it a practice to remember, not just names, but details about people's lives. When I see someone again, I ask about their children by name, their projects, their challenges. This creates an immediate sense of continuity and connection that most people rarely experience in their professional or social interactions. The simple act of remembering and using someone's name correctly is one of the most sincere compliments you can pay. It costs nothing, takes minimal effort, yet delivers maximum impact on relationship building. In a world where most people feel invisible and anonymous, the person who remembers names becomes extraordinarily magnetic. Roosevelt's notebooks taught me that relationships aren't built on grand gestures, but on consistent small acts of recognition. When you remember someone's name, you're acknowledging their individuality and worth. You're saying, without words, you matter to me. The most profound lesson in human relations came to me through observing Charles Schwab, the man who built the steel industry and earned more money than any corporate executive of his time. When I asked him the secret of his extraordinary success in managing people, his answer revolutionized my understanding of human nature. I consider my ability to arouse enthusiasm among people the greatest asset I possess, Schwab told me, and the way to develop the best that is in a person is by appreciation and encouragement. There is nothing else that so kills the ambitions of a person as criticisms from superiors. I never criticize anyone. I believe in giving a person incentive to work, so I am anxious to praise, but loath to find fault. But as I studied Schwab's interactions more closely, I discovered something even more powerful than his philosophy of praise. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to become genuinely fascinated by every person he encountered. Whether speaking with a steel worker or a board member, Schwab would lean in with complete attention, ask thoughtful questions, and listen as if that person held the most interesting secrets in the world. I watched him transform a labor dispute that had been raging for weeks simply by spending an hour walking through the factory floor, stopping to ask workers about their techniques, their challenges, their ideas for improvement. He wasn't pretending to be interested. He was genuinely curious about their expertise and their perspectives. By the end of his visit, the workers felt heard, valued, and motivated to find solutions rather than maintain conflicts. This taught me that genuine interest in others is perhaps the rarest and most magnetic quality a person can possess. In a world where most people are desperately trying to be interesting, the person who is genuinely interested stands out like a beacon. I began experimenting with this principle in my own interactions. Instead of preparing clever things to say, I started preparing thoughtful questions to ask. Instead of thinking about how to impress others, I focused on discovering what was impressive about them. The results were extraordinary. Conversations that once felt forced and artificial became natural and engaging. People began seeking me out, sharing their concerns, asking for my advice. The key insight is understanding that every person you meet knows something you don't know, has experienced something you haven't experienced. and has a perspective that could enrich your understanding of the world. When you approach others with this mindset, your curiosity becomes authentic and your attention becomes magnetic. I learned to ask questions that went beyond surface pleasantries. Instead of, "How's work?" as I would ask, "What's the most interesting challenge you're working on right now?" Instead of "nice weather," I would say, "What do you love most about this time of year?" These questions invited people to share something meaningful rather than exchange meaningless pleasantries, but genuine. Interest goes beyond asking good questions. It requires truly listening to the answers. I discovered that most people have never experienced being completely heard. They're so accustomed to conversations where the other person is just waiting for their turn to speak that when someone actually focuses on understanding their words, they're magnetically drawn to that person. I practiced what I call fascinated listening, approaching every conversation as if the other person might reveal something that could change my life. Whether they were discussing their hobby, their work challenges, or their family situation, I listened with the intensity of a student learning from a master teacher. The transformation this created in my relationships was remarkable. Business. Associates began confiding in me about their concerns and aspirations. Students in my classes opened up about their fears and dreams. Even strangers at social events would find themselves sharing personal stories with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding their world. Schwab showed me that this principle works at every level of human interaction. He would spend as much time learning about a janitor's family as a president's business strategy, and both would leave the conversation feeling energized and valued. This wasn't a technique. It was an authentic appreciation for the infinite, variety, and richness of human experience. The psychological principle underlying this is profound. People are naturally drawn to those who make them feel important and interesting. When you focus genuine attention on someone, you're giving them one of the most precious gifts possible, the experience of feeling truly seen and valued by another human being. I learned to become fascinated by people's passions, even when they differed dramatically from my own interests. A farmer's insights about soil management became as engaging as an artist's description of color theory when I approached both with genuine curiosity about their expertise and enthusiasm. This principle transformed not only my ability to connect with others, but my own growth as a person. By becoming genuinely interested in others, I gained access to thousands of different perspectives, experiences, and areas of knowledge that expanded my understanding of human nature and the world we share. The person who masters genuine interest in others never lacks for meaningful relationships or interesting conversations. They become a magnet for connection because they offer something increasingly rare in our self-focused world: authentic attention and appreciation for the unique value every person possesses. One of the most transformative insights I gained about human nature came from studying John D. Rockefeller Sr., a man who built not just financial wealth, but extraordinary loyalty among his employees. When I analyzed his personal philosophy and methods, I discovered he had mastered something that most leaders completely overlook: the profound human need to feel important and valued. Rockefeller understood that every person, regardless of their position in society, carries within them a deep desire to feel significant. He once told me, "I believe that every right-thinking man has a desire to do something worthwhile in life, and I try to help him find that something." This wasn't mere sentiment. It was a practical philosophy that created unshakable loyalty throughout his organization. I watched this principle work miracles in the most ordinary situations. During one of my visits to his offices, I observed Rockefeller spend 15 minutes with a janitor who had developed a more efficient method for cleaning the marble floors. Instead of simply thanking the man, Rockefeller asked detailed questions about the technique, praised the innovation, and implemented the method throughout all his buildings. More importantly, he made sure other employees knew the improvement came from this janitor's creativity. That janitor left the conversation walking taller, working harder, and telling everyone he knew about working for a man who valued his contributions. The cost to Rockefeller was 15 minutes of attention. The return was a lifetime of loyalty and effort from someone who felt genuinely important to the organization's success. This taught me that making others feel important isn't about grand gestures or expensive rewards. It's about recognizing and acknowledging the value that every person brings to their role in relationships. The magic happens when someone realizes that their efforts matter, their ideas have value, and their contributions make a meaningful difference. I began implementing this principle in my own teaching and business relationships. When a student offered an insight during class, instead of simply saying, "Good point," I would elaborate. "That's an excellent observation, Robert. You've identified something that could help everyone here communicate more effectively. Can you share how you discovered that principle?" This transformation of a simple acknowledgement into meaningful recognition had profound effects on class participation and student confidence. The psychological foundation is simple, yet powerful. People will work harder and more creatively for someone who makes them feel important than for someone who offers only monetary rewards or critical feedback. When you help someone feel valued for who they are and what they contribute, you tap into their deepest motivational forces. But I learned the crucial distinction between making someone feel important and flattering them. Flattery is hollow and manipulative. People sense its insincerity immediately. Making someone feel important is specific, truthful, and focused on their genuine contributions or character qualities. It's the difference between saying, "You're wonderful," and saying, "Your patience with that difficult customer today showed real professionalism and helped turn a negative situation into a positive one." Rockefeller showed me that this principle works at every level of human interaction. He treated his personal servants with the same respect he showed business partners, remembering their families' names, acknowledging their expertise in their areas, and consulting them on matters within their knowledge. This created an atmosphere where everyone, regardless of their position, felt like a valued member of his extended team. I discovered that simple phrases carry extraordinary power when they're genuine and specific. Your idea really helped me. Think about this differently. I noticed how carefully you handled that situation. Your experience with this issue could help all of us. These statements cost nothing but deliver profound satisfaction to people who rarely hear that their contributions matter. The implementation requires genuine observation and authentic appreciation. You must actively look for opportunities to acknowledge people's efforts, insights, and character qualities. A receptionist who maintains composure under pressure, a colleague who offers creative solutions, a server who provides exceptional attention. Each represents an opportunity to help someone feel important for something they do well. I learned to be specific in my recognition. Instead of general praise, I would identify particular actions or qualities. The way you explained that complex concept made it clear for everyone in the room. Or your willingness to stay late to help that. Customer shows real dedication to service. This specificity proves you've actually noticed and valued their contribution. The ripple effects are extraordinary. When people feel important, they become more confident, more creative, more willing to take initiative. They begin living up to the positive recognition they've received. Organizations, families, and communities transform when members consistently help each other feel valued and significant. Rockefeller's greatest business insight wasn't financial, it was human. He understood that in a world where most people feel unnoticed and unappreciated, the person who consistently makes others feel important becomes extraordinarily influential and beloved. This principle doesn't require special talent or training, just the discipline to notice and acknowledge the value that surrounds us in every human interaction. Perhaps the most valuable lesson I ever learned about human relations came from studying. Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic correspondence during the Constitutional Convention. Franklin had mastered something that eludes most people their entire lives: how to disagree with others while actually strengthening the relationship rather than damaging it. I discovered that Franklin had developed what he called his method of disagreeing without being disagreeable. When faced with strong opposition to his ideas, instead of arguing or attacking, he would respond with phrases like, "I may be wrong, but here's how I see it." Or, "You may be right, but have you considered this perspective?" This approach immediately diffused hostility and opened minds to genuine discussion. The breakthrough insight came when I realized that most arguments aren't really about facts or ideas. They're about ego and the need to be right. When you directly contradict someone, you're not just challenging their opinion, you're challenging their intelligence, their judgment, their worth as a thinking person. This triggers defensive reactions that make productive discussion impossible. I tested Franklin's approach during a heated faculty meeting where colleagues were divided over curriculum changes. Instead of presenting my opposing view directly, I said, "You've raised some excellent points that I hadn't considered. I wonder if we might also look at this from another angle." Then I presented my perspective as an additional consideration. Rather than a contradiction of their ideas, the transformation was remarkable. Instead of the usual defensive arguments, my colleagues began engaging with genuine curiosity about this alternative perspective. By avoiding direct contradiction, I had preserved their dignity while introducing new ideas for consideration. The meeting ended with a collaborative solution that incorporated insights from multiple viewpoints. Franklin taught me that the words "you're wrong" may be the most relationship-destroying phrase in any language. Even when someone is factually incorrect, directly contradicting them creates resistance rather than openness to truth. Instead, Franklin would say things like, "I used to think the same way, but then I discovered," or "That's an interesting point. What do you think about this additional information?" The psychology behind this is profound. When you allow people to save face while considering new information, they're much more likely to genuinely evaluate different perspectives. When you attack their current position, they become invested in defending it regardless of new evidence that emerges. I learned to use what I call cushioning phrases that soften disagreement while preserving relationships. Instead of "that's not right," I would say, "I see it differently," or "my experience has been..." Instead of "you're missing the point," I might say, "another way to look at this might be..." These small changes in language create enormous differences in how people receive and process contradictory information. Franklin showed me the power of asking questions rather than making statements when you disagree. Instead of declaring, "that approach won't work," he might ask, "What do you think might happen if we tried this alternative approach?" Questions invite collaboration and discovery, rather than triggering defensive resistance. I discovered that timing matters enormously in disagreements. Franklin would often wait for emotions to cool before introducing opposing viewpoints. He understood that people can't process logical arguments when they're emotionally aroused. Sometimes the wisest response to strong disagreement is, "That's definitely worth thinking about. Let me consider your points and get back to you." The most powerful technique I learned from Franklin was acknowledging the strength in someone's position before introducing alternatives. You're absolutely right that quality is crucial, and I agree that we can't compromise on that. I'm wondering if there might be a way to maintain quality while also addressing the timeline concerns. This approach shows respect for their judgment while expanding the discussion. I implemented this in my business relationships with extraordinary results. A client who had been resistant to my proposals became collaborative when I stopped trying to prove him wrong and started acknowledging the wisdom in his concerns while introducing additional considerations. A colleague who had been argumentative became cooperative when I began treating his ideas as valuable contributions to be built upon rather than obstacles to be overcome. Franklin's correspondence revealed that he had transformed enemies into allies not through superior arguments, but through superior relationship management. He understood that preserving someone's dignity and self-respect was more important than winning any individual disagreement. The ultimate insight is that you can disagree with someone's ideas while affirming their worth as a person. You can introduce contradictory information while honoring their intelligence. You can advocate for different approaches while respecting their judgment. This isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about engaging in disagreement in ways that strengthen rather than damage relationships. Franklin proved that the most persuasive people aren't those who argue most forcefully, but those who disagree most gracefully. When you master this principle, you don't just win more arguments, you build stronger relationships with people who appreciate your respectful approach to differences of opinion. In a world full of people trying to prove others wrong, the person who helps others save face while discovering truth becomes extraordinarily influential and trusted. One of the most counterintuitive lessons I learned about building strong relationships came through my own painful experience with a devastating public mistake. I had criticized a fellow instructor's teaching methods in front of his students, and when I realized how wrong I had been, I faced a choice that would define my understanding of human psychology forever. My first instinct was to justify my actions, minimize the damage, or quietly hope the incident would be forgotten. But I had been studying the relationship patterns of successful leaders, and I remembered something extraordinary about how they handled their mistakes. They didn't hide from them. They owned them completely and immediately. I decided to write a public letter admitting my error, not just acknowledging that I was wrong, but emphasizing how wrong I had been and how much I respected the colleague I had unfairly criticized. I expected this admission would damage my reputation and credibility. Instead, something magical happened. The colleague I had wronged became one of my strongest supporters. Other faculty members who had witnessed the original incident developed greater respect for my character. Students in my classes began trusting me more because they had seen evidence that I valued truth over my own ego. My admission of error had actually strengthened my relationships rather than weakening them. This experience taught me that there's tremendous power in beating others to the punch when you've made a mistake. When you admit your errors immediately and emphatically, you accomplish several psychological miracles simultaneously. You disarm criticism, demonstrate strength of character, and create an atmosphere where others feel safe to admit their own mistakes. I began studying this principle in various contexts and discovered that the most trusted leaders, the strongest, marriages, and the most effective teams all shared this characteristic. They had created cultures where admitting mistakes was seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When someone is preparing to criticize your mistake and you beat them to it, with a thorough, honest admission, their anger deflates and often transforms into respect. They can't attack someone who has already acknowledged the problem more completely than they intended to do themselves. I learned to make my admissions complete and emphatic rather than minimal and grudging. Instead of saying, "I might have been wrong about that," I would say, "I was completely wrong about that, and I want to apologize for my poor judgment." Instead of, "Maybe I could have handled that better," I would say, "I handled that poorly, and I take full responsibility for the problems it created." This approach requires genuine humility and the willingness to prioritize relationships over ego protection. But the results are extraordinary. People are naturally drawn to those who can admit mistakes because it demonstrates authenticity, wisdom, and strength of character. It also creates psychological safety. Others know they can be honest about their own errors without fear of judgment. I implemented this principle in my business relationships with remarkable results. When I made an error in a client proposal, instead of making excuses or blaming circumstances, I called immediately to acknowledge the mistake completely and outline how I would fix it. Not only did the client continue working with me, but they referred new business because they trusted someone who took full responsibility for problems. The technique works because it demonstrates several admirable qualities simultaneously. First, it shows you have enough confidence to acknowledge imperfection without being destroyed by it. Second, it proves you value truth and relationships more than your own image. Third, it demonstrates the kind of character people want to associate with in their personal and professional lives. I discovered that admitting mistakes also has a powerful modeling effect on others. When you demonstrate that errors can be acknowledged without catastrophic consequences, you give others permission to be honest about their own mistakes. This creates an atmosphere of trust and continuous improvement rather than fear and blame. The key is timing and completeness. The admission must come immediately upon recognizing the error, and it must be thorough rather than grudging, half-hearted. Acknowledgments that minimize the mistake or include justifications defeat the purpose and can actually damage relationships more than saying nothing. I learned to separate the mistake from my identity. Admitting I had made a poor decision didn't mean I was a poor person. It meant I was a person capable of growth and learning. This distinction allowed me to acknowledge errors without attacking my own self-worth. The most powerful discovery was that people actually trust you more after you've admitted a significant mistake and handled it well. They've seen evidence that you're honest, accountable, and strong enough to face difficult truths. These qualities are so rare that when people encounter them, they want to build closer relationships with someone who possesses them. In a world where most people spend enormous energy protecting their image and avoiding blame, the person who readily admits mistakes and takes full responsibility becomes extraordinarily trustworthy and magnetic. This isn't about becoming a doormat or accepting blame for everything. It's about having the character strength to acknowledge your real errors quickly and completely, turning relationship threats into relationship opportunities. The most transformative insight I gained about influencing others came from studying President William McKinley's approach to winning over political opponents. McKinley had mastered something that most people completely overlook: the extraordinary power of beginning every interaction with genuine friendliness, regardless of the underlying tension or disagreement. I discovered that McKinley would start even the most contentious political meetings by finding something positive to say about his opponent's character, their dedication to public service, or their genuine concern for the country's welfare. He understood that the first 30 seconds of any interaction set the emotional tone for everything that followed. This principle became crystal clear to me during a particularly challenging situation with a business partner who was threatening to dissolve our partnership over a disagreement about company direction. My instinct was to begin our meeting by defending my position and pointing out the flaws in his reasoning. Instead, I decided to test McKinley's approach. I started by genuinely acknowledging his commitment to the company's success, his valuable contributions over the years, and my respect for his business judgment. Only after establishing this foundation of mutual respect did I introduce my concerns about our disagreement. The transformation was remarkable. Instead of the hostile confrontation I had expected, we had a productive discussion that led to a creative solution neither of us had previously considered. The psychology behind this is profound. When you begin with friendliness and genuine appreciation, you create what I call emotional rapport that makes people naturally more receptive to whatever follows. When you begin with criticism or confrontation, you trigger defensive reactions that make productive communication nearly impossible. I learned to apply this principle even in situations where I had legitimate grievances. If an employee had made a significant error, instead of launching into criticism, I would begin by acknowledging their usual good performance and my confidence in their abilities. This approach opened their mind to learning rather than activating their defensiveness. McKinley's letters revealed that he had won over some of his harshest critics simply by beginning their relationships with genuine friendliness rather than political maneuvering. He would find authentic common ground, shared concerns about the country, similar family situations, or mutual respect for certain principles, and build from there. The key insight is that friendliness must be authentic, rather than manipulative. People can sense immediately when warmth is genuine versus when it's a tactic to soften them up for an attack. True friendliness comes from genuinely finding something to appreciate about the person, even when you disagree with their actions or opinions. I developed what I call the friendly foundation technique. Before any difficult conversation, I identify something I genuinely appreciate about the other person, their intentions, their efforts, their character, their expertise in some area. I begin the interaction by expressing this appreciation honestly, which creates an atmosphere of mutual respect. This approach works because it addresses a fundamental human need. Everyone wants to feel valued and respected, especially when they're about to discuss difficult topics. When you begin with genuine appreciation, you're telling the other person that despite your disagreements, you still see them as worthy of respect and consideration. I tested this principle in various challenging situations. With a demanding client who was constantly criticizing our work, I began our meetings by acknowledging her high standards and commitment to excellence. With a difficult neighbor who complained about everything, I started conversations by recognizing his genuine concern for the neighborhood's well-being. In each case, beginning with authentic friendliness, transformed hostile relationships into collaborative ones. The technique requires discipline because our natural tendency is to begin difficult conversations by stating our grievances or jumping directly to the problem. But McKinley taught me that investing the first few minutes in genuine appreciation creates emotional conditions that make everything else more productive. I learned to distinguish between friendliness and weakness. Being genuinely warm and appreciative doesn't mean avoiding difficult topics or failing to address problems. It means creating the optimal emotional environment for productive discussion of those issues. You can be simultaneously friendly and firm, warm, and direct. The physiological impact is remarkable. When someone experiences genuine friendliness at the beginning of an interaction, their stress hormones decrease and their receptivity increases. They're literally more capable of hearing and processing what you have to say because they're not consumed with defending themselves against perceived attack. McKinley proved that you can disagree with someone's actions while affirming your respect for them as a person. You can address problems while maintaining the relationship. You can be direct about issues while preserving dignity and connection. This principle transformed not only my ability to handle difficult conversations, but my understanding of human influence itself. The most persuasive people aren't those who present the strongest arguments. They're those who create the emotional conditions where others feel safe enough to consider different perspectives. In a world where most people begin difficult conversations with complaints, criticism, or confrontation, the person who consistently starts with genuine friendliness becomes extraordinarily influential. They create an atmosphere where problems can be solved, relationships can be strengthened, and mutual understanding can develop even in the midst of significant disagreements. The most elegant technique I ever learned for influencing others came from studying the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates and his method of leading people to conclusions through strategic questioning. Socrates understood something that most people miss entirely. When you can get someone saying yes immediately, you create psychological momentum that makes them more likely to agree with larger requests later. I discovered this principle while researching Socrates' dialogues and realized he rarely told people they were wrong or tried to force his conclusions on them. Instead, he would ask a series of questions that led people to discover the truth for themselves. More importantly, he structured these questions so that the natural, honest answer was yes. The breakthrough moment came when I applied this technique during a particularly challenging sales situation. I was trying to convince a skeptical client to invest in our training program, and my usual approach of presenting benefits and features was meeting with resistance. Instead, I decided to test the Socratic method. I began by asking questions I knew would generate agreement. Would you agree that your sales team's effectiveness directly impacts your company's revenue? Yes. And you'd want any training investment to produce measurable results? Yes. So if I could show you a program that has consistently improved sales performance for companies similar to yours, that would be worth considering? Yes. By the time I presented our specific program, the client had already agreed to the underlying principles that made our solution logical. The yes momentum I had created made him psychologically more receptive to the final proposal. What had seemed like a difficult sale became a natural conclusion to our series of agreements. Socrates taught me that this technique works because of a fundamental principle of human psychology. People want to be consistent with their previous statements and commitments. When someone has said yes to several related points, they feel internal pressure to maintain that consistency by agreeing with the logical conclusion of those points. I learned to structure conversations by identifying the underlying principles that both parties could agree on before introducing any controversial elements. If I wanted someone to change their approach to a project, I would first get them to agree that project success was important, that team collaboration was valuable, and that we should use the most effective methods available. The key is asking questions that any reasonable person would answer affirmatively. These aren't trick questions or manipulative traps. They're genuine inquiries about shared values and common sense principles. The goal is to establish a foundation of agreement before building toward your specific request or recommendation. I discovered that timing is crucial with this technique. The yes questions must come naturally in the conversation and feel relevant to the discussion. When forced or artificial, they backfire and create suspicion rather than momentum. The art is in identifying the genuine points of agreement that logically lead to your conclusion. Socrates showed me the power of letting people convince themselves rather than trying to convince them directly. When someone reaches a conclusion through their own reasoning process, guided by strategic questions, they feel ownership of that conclusion rather than resistance to an external suggestion. I applied this principle in various challenging situations. With a resistant teenager, instead of lecturing about responsibility, I asked questions that led her to identify the benefits of keeping commitments. With a colleague opposed to a new procedure, I asked questions about our shared goals that helped him see how the procedure would serve those goals. The technique requires genuine curiosity and respect for the other person's intelligence. You're not trying to trap them into agreement. You're helping them think through the logical implications of their own values and priorities. This creates authentic persuasion rather than manipulative pressure. I learned to listen carefully to people's answers and adjust my questions based on their responses. Sometimes their yes answers revealed assumptions I hadn't considered or concerns I needed to address. The technique becomes a collaborative exploration of ideas rather than a one-sided presentation. The psychological foundation is simple but powerful. People are more committed to conclusions they reach themselves than to conclusions imposed on them by others. When you guide someone to discover your perspective through their own reasoning, they become advocates for that perspective rather than opponents of it. Socrates proved that the most influential people aren't those who make the strongest arguments. They're those who ask the best questions. Questions that invite people to examine their own beliefs, consider new possibilities, and reach conclusions through their own thought processes. This principle transformed my understanding of persuasion from pushing ideas onto others to helping others discover ideas for themselves. Instead of trying to overcome resistance, I learned to create conditions where resistance dissolves naturally through the power of self-discovery. The yes momentum technique works because it aligns with, rather than fights against, human psychology. People want to feel intelligent, consistent, and autonomous in their decision-making. When you help them say yes to logical steps that lead to your conclusion, You're honoring these psychological needs while achieving your influence goals. In a world where most people try to force agreement through argument and pressure, the person who creates agreement through strategic questioning becomes extraordinarily persuasive and trusted. One of the most powerful influence techniques I ever discovered came through a painful lesson in human psychology. I had developed what I believed was a brilliant solution to improve our training program's effectiveness, but when I presented it enthusiastically to my team, I met unexpected resistance from several key members who found flaws and objections I hadn't anticipated. Frustrated by their lack of enthusiasm for what seemed like an obvious improvement, I decided to try a completely different approach. Instead of presenting my solution, I described the challenges we were facing and asked the team to brainstorm potential solutions. Through carefully crafted questions and strategic guidance, I helped them discover the same solution I had already developed, but now they felt like the creative originators of the idea. The transformation was remarkable. The same people who had resisted my brilliant solution became passionate advocates for their innovative approach. They refined it, improved it, and implemented it with an enthusiasm I never could have generated through direct presentation. I had learned one of the most fundamental truths about human nature. People support most enthusiastically the ideas they feel they've created themselves. This experience taught me that the source of an idea matters far less than the ownership someone feels toward it. When people believe an idea originated from their own thinking, they become emotionally invested in its success. When they perceive an idea as imposed from outside, even excellent ideas often face resistance simply because they threaten the person's sense of autonomy and creativity. I began studying how masterful leaders implement this principle, and I discovered that the most successful managers, teachers, and parents rarely present solutions directly. Instead, they create conditions where others discover those solutions through guided exploration and strategic questioning. The technique requires patience and genuine respect for others' intelligence. Rather than rushing to share your insights, you must slow down and help others reach those same insights through their own thought processes. This means asking questions like, "What do you think might happen if we tried?" instead of stating, "We should do this because." I learned to plant seeds of ideas through subtle suggestions and partial thoughts, then allow others to water and grow those seeds into full-fledged solutions. For example, instead of proposing a new filing system, I might mention casually that I've been wondering if there might be a more efficient way to organize our client information, and then ask for their thoughts on improvement possibilities. The psychological foundation is rooted in fundamental human needs for autonomy, competence, and significance. When someone feels they've contributed creatively to solving a problem, all three needs are satisfied simultaneously. They feel autonomous because the choice was theirs, competent because they generated a valuable solution, and significant because their thinking made a meaningful difference. I discovered that this principle works even when people know you're using it. During one consultation, I explained to a client that I was going to ask questions designed to help him discover solutions rather than presenting recommendations directly. He appreciated the approach because it honored his expertise and judgment, while still providing guidance toward effective solutions. The key is genuine collaboration rather than manipulation. The goal isn't to trick people into accepting your ideas, it's to help them think through problems thoroughly and reach the best possible conclusions, whether those align with your initial thoughts or lead to something even better. I learned to ask questions that opened new avenues of thinking. What if we approached this from a different angle? What would happen if we tried the opposite approach? Who else has faced this kind of challenge, and how did they handle it? These questions stimulate creative thinking that often leads to solutions neither party had initially considered. The technique requires surrendering ego attachment to being recognized as the source of good ideas. The satisfaction comes not from getting credit for brilliance, but from seeing others succeed with solutions they feel proud to have developed. This shift from seeking personal recognition to enabling others' success creates deeper influence and stronger relationships. I found that people often improve on ideas when they feel ownership of them. Their additional insights, modifications, and refinements frequently result in better solutions than what I had originally conceived. By letting go of the need to control the exact outcome, I often achieved better results than direct presentation would have produced. The implementation requires strategic patience. Instead of immediate agreement, you invest time in guided discovery. That creates lasting commitment. People don't just accept ideas they've helped develop. They champion them, refine them, and persist through implementation challenges because they feel personal responsibility for their success. This principle transformed my understanding of leadership from directive instruction to collaborative facilitation. The most influential people aren't those who have the best ideas. They're those who help others discover and develop their best ideas. In a world where most people want to be recognized for their brilliance, the person who helps others feel brilliant becomes extraordinarily influential and valued. The most profound shift in my understanding of human relations came through what I now call my empathy experiments, a series of deliberate attempts to see situations entirely through other people's eyes, especially those with whom I was experiencing conflict or misunderstanding. My first experiment involved a particularly difficult landlord who seemed unreasonably demanding about property maintenance and rent collection. My initial reaction was frustration and resentment. I saw him as greedy and inconsiderate, but I decided to spend a week trying to understand his perspective completely, as if I were experiencing his exact situation with his responsibilities and concerns. I discovered that this man owned several properties as his sole source of income to support an elderly mother and disabled brother. Late rent payments created genuine financial hardship for his family. Property damage meant expensive repairs he couldn't afford to delay. What I had interpreted as greed was actually anxiety about his ability to meet his family responsibilities. When I approached our next interaction from this understanding, everything changed. Instead of defensively justifying late payments, I acknowledged the stress this must create for someone supporting family members. Instead of resenting his maintenance requirements, I expressed appreciation for his commitment to keeping the property in good condition. Our adversarial relationship transformed into a cooperative partnership. This experience taught me that most interpersonal conflicts stem not from fundamental character differences, but from incomplete understanding of each other's circumstances, pressures, and perspectives. When you truly see a situation through someone else's eyes, their actions that seemed unreasonable or hostile often become completely understandable, even admirable. I began applying this principle systematically in my business relationships. When a client became demanding and critical, instead of becoming defensive, I would ask myself, what pressures might they be facing that would make them behave this way? Often I discovered they were under intense pressure from their own superiors, facing tight deadlines, or dealing with budget constraints that made them hypersensitive to any problems. The technique requires genuine curiosity about others' experiences rather than assumptions about their motivations. I learned to ask questions like, "Help me understand the pressures you're facing with this project," or "What would make this situation ideal from your perspective?" These questions revealed concerns and constraints I had never considered. I discovered that perspective-taking goes far beyond intellectual understanding. It requires emotional empathy. You must genuinely imagine experiencing their fears, hopes, pressures, and responsibilities. When a colleague seemed resistant to change, I would consider, if I had invested years developing expertise in the current system, how would I feel about proposals that might make that expertise obsolete? The psychological foundation is simple, but powerful. People drop their defenses and become cooperative when they feel truly understood. When someone realizes you've made the effort to see their situation accurately, they become naturally more willing to consider your perspective in return. I learned to look for the logical reasons behind seemingly irrational behavior. An employee who consistently arrived late might be dealing with child care challenges or transportation issues. A customer who seemed unreasonably demanding might be facing pressure from their own clients or supervisors. When you understand the logic behind someone's actions, you can address their real concerns rather than fighting their symptoms. The technique transformed my approach to difficult conversations. Instead of beginning with my complaints or demands, I would start by demonstrating understanding of their perspective. I can see that you're dealing with multiple priorities and tight deadlines, which must make additional requests feel overwhelming. This approach immediately shifted the dynamic from adversarial to collaborative. I discovered that accurate perspective-taking often reveals win-win solutions that weren't obvious when I was focused solely on my own viewpoint. When I understood both sets of concerns and constraints, creative alternatives frequently emerged that served everyone's interests more effectively than our original positions. The practice requires setting aside your own emotional reactions temporarily to fully inhabit someone else's experience. This doesn't mean abandoning your own needs or agreeing with everything they do. It means understanding their actions from their internal frame of reference before developing your response. I learned that people can sense when you're genuinely trying to understand them versus when you're just gathering information to defeat their arguments. Authentic perspective-taking creates trust and connection, while manipulative fact-gathering creates suspicion and resistance. The most remarkable discovery was that seeing things from others' perspectives often changed my own views in valuable ways. I frequently found that positions I had dismissed as unreasonable contained important insights I had overlooked. This made me not only more influential, but also wiser and more effective in my own decision-making. This principle revolutionized my understanding of influence from trying to change others' minds to understanding their minds so thoroughly that collaborative solutions become obvious. When you master genuine perspective-taking, you don't just resolve conflicts more effectively. You prevent many conflicts by addressing others' real concerns before they become problems. One of the most transformative moments in my understanding of human nature occurred when I received a letter from a woman whose marriage had been saved by a single phrase I had taught in my course. She wrote that when her husband came home angry about a workplace conflict, instead of offering advice or becoming defensive about his mood, she simply said, "I don't blame you one bit for feeling that way. If I were in your situation, I'd feel exactly the same." Those words, she explained, created an immediate shift. Her husband's anger melted into appreciation for being understood. Instead of the usual argument that his frustration would have triggered, they had their first meaningful conversation in months about his work challenges and how she could support him. That phrase had opened a door to understanding that transformed their entire relationship. This letter taught me something profound about human psychology. People desperately need to feel that their ideas, desires, and emotional reactions are valid and understandable. Most of the time, when someone is upset or frustrated, they don't need solutions. They need validation that their feelings make sense given their circumstances. I began experimenting with sympathetic responses in my own relationships and discovered their extraordinary power. When a student complained about a difficult assignment, instead of explaining why the assignment was necessary, I would first acknowledge, "That does sound frustrating. I can understand why you'd feel overwhelmed by that workload." This validation immediately shifted their attitude from resistance to receptiveness. The key insight is understanding the difference between sympathy and agreement. Being sympathetic to someone's feelings doesn't mean you agree with all their conclusions or support all their actions. It means you recognize that their emotional response is natural and understandable, given their perspective and circumstances. Learn to use what I call validation phrases that acknowledge the legitimacy of others' feelings without necessarily endorsing their proposed solutions. Anyone in your position would feel concerned about that. Your frustration makes perfect sense, given what you've been dealing with. I can see why that would be disappointing. These simple acknowledgments create profound connection and trust. The psychological foundation is rooted in a basic human need for emotional validation. When someone feels angry, frustrated, disappointed, or excited, they want confirmation that these feelings are reasonable responses to their situation. When you provide this validation, you're affirming their emotional intelligence and judgment. I discovered that sympathetic responses must be genuine rather than formulaic. People can immediately sense whether you truly understand and empathize with their experience or whether you're just reciting a technique. Authentic sympathy requires actually imagining yourself in their situation and connecting with how you would feel under those circumstances. The technique works because it addresses the emotional component of human communication before attempting to deal with the logical aspects. When someone feels emotionally understood and validated, they become much more receptive to different perspectives, alternative solutions, and collaborative problem solving. I learned to listen for the emotions behind people's words rather than just the content of their complaints or requests. A customer who seemed unreasonably demanding about product specifications might actually be anxious about how the product would be received by their own clients. An employee who resisted new procedures might be worried about appearing incompetent while learning new systems. The application requires patience because the natural tendency is to jump immediately to problem-solving mode. But I discovered that taking time to acknowledge and validate someone's feelings creates much better conditions for effective problem-solving later in the conversation. I found that sympathetic responses often diffuse conflicts before they escalate. When someone comes to you with strong emotions, they're prepared for argument, dismissal, or minimization of their concerns. When instead they receive understanding and validation, their defensive energy transforms into collaborative energy. The DECA practice extends beyond crisis situations to everyday interactions. When a colleague expresses enthusiasm about an idea that seems impractical, responding with, "I can see why you're excited about that possibility," creates much better groundwork for discussing implementation challenges than immediate criticism of the idea's feasibility. I learned that people often soften their positions naturally when they feel understood. Someone who initially demanded an extreme solution might propose more moderate alternatives once they feel their concerns have been acknowledged and validated. The sympathy doesn't weaken your negotiating position, it strengthens it by creating trust and goodwill. The most profound discovery was that sympathetic responses often reveal information that changes your understanding of the situation. When people feel heard and validated, they frequently share additional context, concerns, or constraints that weren't apparent in their initial presentation. This additional information often leads to better solutions than either party had originally considered. This principle taught me that emotional validation is one of the greatest gifts you can give another person. In a world where most people feel misunderstood and emotionally dismissed, the person who consistently responds with genuine sympathy becomes extraordinarily influential and cherished. The technique doesn't require agreeing with everything others say or do. It requires acknowledging that their emotional responses are understandable human reactions to their circumstances. This simple acknowledgement creates the foundation for all productive human interaction and relationship building. The most remarkable transformation I ever witnessed in human behavior occurred when I learned to appeal to people's higher nature rather than their immediate self-interest. This principle revealed itself during a crisis with a supplier who had been consistently delivering substandard materials, causing delays and quality problems throughout our operation. My initial approach was to threaten contract termination and demand immediate improvements. This created defensiveness and excuses, but no real change in performance. Then I decided to try a completely different strategy based on something I had observed about human psychology. Most people genuinely want to see themselves as honorable, ethical, and committed to doing the right thing. Instead of threats, I approached the supplier with a different message. I know you're a company that takes pride in your reputation and your commitment to customer success. Your history shows you've built this business on quality and reliability. I'm confident that the recent problems don't represent who you really are or what you stand for. Let's work together to get back to the standard of excellence that made me choose to work with you in the first place. The transformation was immediate and lasting. The supplier not only corrected the quality issues, but implemented new quality control procedures that exceeded our original expectations. By appealing to their desire to be seen as a quality-focused, customer-oriented organization, I had motivated changes that threats and demands could never have achieved. This experience taught me that people have an inherent desire to live up to positive expectations and to see themselves as possessing admirable qualities. When you appeal to these noble motives, you're inviting them to become the best version of themselves rather than defending against criticism or punishment. I began studying how great leaders throughout history had used this principle. Abraham Lincoln consistently appealed to Americans' better angels rather than their fears or prejudices. He spoke about preserving the Union, honoring the founders' vision, and ensuring that democracy could survive for future generations. These noble appeals inspired sacrifices that purely practical arguments could never have motivated. The technique requires identifying the positive qualities and higher purposes that people genuinely value about themselves and their work. A salesperson wants to see themselves as someone who helps customers make good decisions. A teacher wants to believe they're making a meaningful difference in students' lives. A manager wants to feel they're building something valuable and contributing to others' success. I learned to frame requests and feedback in terms of these higher purposes. Instead of telling an employee they needed to improve customer service, to avoid complaints, I would say, "I know how much you care about helping customers have positive experiences. Your expertise could really make a difference for someone facing this type of challenge." The psychological foundation is profound. People are naturally motivated to maintain consistency between their self-image and their actions. When you remind them of their noble qualities and purposes, you create internal pressure to live up to those ideals. This motivation is far more powerful and sustainable than external pressure or threats. I discovered that this principle works even with people who have been behaving badly. Instead of attacking their character, I would appeal to the better person I knew they could be. This doesn't seem like you. I've seen you handle difficult situations with real professionalism, and I know you care about doing quality work. The key is finding authentic, noble motives rather than manufacturing false ones. Every person has some positive qualities, some higher purposes they genuinely care about, some way they want to be seen by others and themselves. The art is identifying these genuine motivations and connecting them to the behavior you want to encourage. I learned that appealing to noble motives often reveals information about what really drives people. When I framed a request in terms of their professional reputation or their commitment to helping others, people would often share their deeper concerns and motivations, leading to much more effective collaboration. The technique requires patience because it works on intrinsic motivation rather than immediate compliance. People need time to connect your request with their own values and see how the proposed action aligns with who they want to be. But the resulting commitment is much stronger and more lasting than behavior motivated by fear or immediate rewards. I found that this approach often elevates the entire conversation to a higher level. Instead of negotiating about immediate problems or conflicts, you're discussing shared values, common purposes, and mutual aspirations. This creates partnership rather than adversarial relationships. The most remarkable discovery was that appealing to noble motives often brings out qualities in people that they didn't know they possessed. When you consistently treat someone as if they have high integrity, genuine concern for others, and commitment to excellence, they often develop these qualities more fully than they had before. This principle transformed my understanding of motivation from external pressure to internal inspiration. The most influential people don't force compliance through threats or bribes. They inspire commitment by connecting with people's deepest values and highest aspirations. In a world where most people use criticism, pressure, and self-interest to motivate others, the person who consistently appeals to noble motives becomes extraordinarily influential and respected. They don't just get better results, they help others become better people in the process. The power of dramatization to transform rejected ideas into accepted innovations became clear to me during one of the most challenging presentations of my career. I was trying to convince a group of skeptical business leaders to invest in employee training, and my carefully prepared facts and statistics were meeting with polite but obvious disinterest. Sensing I was losing my audience, I abandoned my prepared material and tried something completely different. I asked one of the executives to help me with a demonstration. I had him attempt to tie a complex knot while I rapidly called out contradictory instructions, criticized his technique, and pointed out his mistakes. Within moments, he was frustrated, confused, and ready to give up. Then I asked another executive to attempt the same knot while I patiently demonstrated each step, offered encouragement, and celebrated small successes. The contrast was dramatic and immediate. The entire room could see the difference in motivation, confidence, and results between the two approaches. This, I said, is the difference between traditional management methods and the training approach I'm proposing. Which type of instruction would you want for your employees? The response was immediate and enthusiastic. What 20 minutes of statistics couldn't accomplish, a simple 3-minute demonstration achieved completely. This experience taught me that humans are fundamentally experiential learners. We don't just think with our minds. We think with our emotions, our senses, and our imaginations. When you can make an abstract concept concrete and visible, you bypass intellectual resistance and connect directly with people's understanding. I began studying how successful people throughout history had used dramatization to sell ideas that seemed impossible. The Wright brothers didn't convince people that flight was possible through theoretical arguments, they demonstrated it. Thomas Edison didn't persuade investors about electric lighting through scientific papers. He lit up entire districts and let people see the transformation. The principle works because dramatization creates emotional experience rather than just intellectual understanding. When people can see, feel, or experience your idea rather than just think about it, they develop ownership and excitement that pure logic rarely generates. I learned to look for ways to make abstract benefits concrete and visible. Instead of talking about improved efficiency, I would show the time difference between old and new methods. Instead of describing better customer relationships, I would role-play positive and negative service interactions. Instead of explaining cost savings, I would demonstrate the actual dollars saved over specific time periods. The technique requires creativity and willingness to step outside conventional presentation formats. Most people present ideas through talking and showing slides. Dramatization involves the audience actively in experiencing the idea's benefits or the problems it solves. I discovered that simple props and demonstrations often work better than elaborate productions. A few carefully chosen visual aids that let people handle, compare, or experience differences create more impact than sophisticated multimedia presentations. The goal is participation and experience, not entertainment. The psychological foundation is rooted in how memory and persuasion actually work. People remember experiences much more vividly than information. They're convinced by what they feel and see more than by what they're told. When you dramatize an idea, you create memorable experiences that continue influencing them long after logical arguments are forgotten. I learned that dramatization works especially well for overcoming skepticism and resistance when people can experience the benefits directly rather than just hearing claims about them. Their objections often dissolve naturally. Seeing is believing in ways that hearing never achieves. The application extends beyond formal presentations to everyday influence situations. When trying to convince a colleague to try a new procedure instead of explaining its benefits, I might demonstrate a quick comparison between the old and new approaches. When helping someone understand a problem, I might create a simple simulation that makes the issue visible and tangible. I found that involving people in the dramatization increases its impact exponentially. When audience members participate in demonstrations, role plays, or hands-on experiences, they become advocates for the idea rather than passive recipients of information. They convince themselves through their own experience. The key is matching the dramatization to your specific audience and idea. A demonstration that works with engineers might be different from one that works with artists. The goal is finding the sensory experiential approach that makes your particular concept come alive for your particular audience. I learned that even failed dramatizations often succeed better than perfect logical presentations. When people see you trying to make an idea tangible and experiential, they appreciate the effort and engage more actively with the underlying concept, even if the demonstration isn't flawless. The most powerful discovery was that dramatization often improves the ideas themselves. The process of figuring out how to make a concept visible and experiential forces you to understand it more deeply and often reveals improvements or applications you hadn't considered. This principle transformed my approach to influence from telling people about ideas to letting them experience ideas. In a world saturated with information and logical arguments, the person who can make ideas come alive through dramatization becomes extraordinarily persuasive and memorable. The most unexpected breakthrough in motivating others came when I discovered the extraordinary power of challenges to tap into people's competitive spirit and desire to prove themselves. This revelation occurred during a crisis with our training program, when employee enthusiasm had reached an all-time low and traditional motivational approaches were failing completely. Instead of offering more incentives or applying more pressure, I decided to try something radically different. I gathered the team and said, "I've been told that this project is too ambitious for our current capabilities, that we don't have the talent or resources to achieve the results we've been discussing. I don't believe that's true, but I understand why others might think so, given our recent struggles." The transformation was immediate and electric. Instead of defensiveness or discouragement, I saw determination and resolve in their faces. One team member said, "Who told you we couldn't do this? We'll show them what we're capable of." Within weeks, the same people who had been struggling with motivation were working with unprecedented energy and creativity to prove that the challenge could be met. This experience taught me something profound about human psychology. People have an inherent desire to prove their worth, demonstrate their capabilities, and rise to meaningful challenges. When you present a goal as a test of their abilities rather than just another task to complete, you tap into motivational forces that routine requests can never access. I began studying how great leaders throughout history had used challenges to inspire extraordinary performance. Charles Schwab once told me about a steel mill that was consistently underperforming despite bonuses and threats. He visited the plant near the end of a day shift and asked the foreman how many heats his crew had made. 6, came the reply. Schwab wrote a large 6 in chalk on the floor and walked away without another word. When the night shift came in and saw the 6, they asked what it meant. Learning it represented the day shift's production. They worked harder and prouder, chalking up 7 before leaving. The day shift returned to find 7 and was determined not to be outdone. Within weeks, that plant became one of the highest producing facilities in the company. A simple challenge had accomplished what complex incentive systems couldn't achieve. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Challenges appeal to fundamental human needs for competence, recognition, and significance. When you frame a task as a test of someone's abilities, you're inviting them to demonstrate their worth rather than just complete an assignment. This transforms work from obligation into opportunity. I learned that effective challenges must be meaningful but achievable. They should stretch people's capabilities without being impossible. The goal is to create what I call achievable excellence, standards that require growth and effort, but can be reached through dedication and skill development. The key is presenting challenges in ways that honor people's pride and competitive spirit rather than threatening their security or self-worth. Instead of, "You'd better improve or else," the approach is, "I believe you have the talent to achieve something remarkable here. Are you willing to prove me right?" I discovered that public challenges often work better than private ones because they tap into people's desire for recognition and respect from peers. When someone accepts a challenge in front of others, they feel accountability not just to you, but to everyone who knows about their commitment. The technique works across all types of relationships. With students, I might say, "This assignment is considered one of the most challenging in the program. Previous classes have told me it's nearly impossible to excel at it. I'm curious to see what this group can accomplish." With employees, our competitors claim this project can't be done within our timeline. I think they're underestimating what we're capable of achieving together. I learned that challenges should focus on effort and growth rather than just outcomes. Instead of, "Can you achieve this result?" the more powerful approach is, "Can you push yourself to grow in ways that make this result possible?" This focuses attention on personal development rather than just performance metrics. The application requires understanding what types of challenges motivate different personalities. Some people respond to individual challenges that test their personal capabilities. Others are more motivated by team challenges that require collaboration and shared achievement. The art is matching the challenge to the person and the situation. I found that following up on challenges is crucial to their effectiveness. People need to know that their efforts are being noticed, their progress is being tracked, and their achievements will be recognized. The challenge creates initial motivation, but ongoing attention sustains the effort required for success. The most remarkable discovery was that people often exceed their own expectations when presented with meaningful challenges. They discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed and develop confidence that extends far beyond the original task. The challenge becomes a catalyst for broader personal and professional growth. This principle transformed my understanding of motivation from external pressure to internal drive. The most effective leaders don't push people toward goals. They issue challenges that make people want to push themselves toward excellence. The most extraordinary transformation I ever witnessed in human relationships occurred when I learned to convert my harshest critics into my most enthusiastic supporters. This breakthrough came during one of the darkest periods of my career, when a prominent educator named Dr. Harrison had been publicly criticizing my teaching methods and questioning my qualifications to train others in human relations. My initial reaction was defensiveness and counterattack. I prepared detailed rebuttals to his criticisms and considered responding publicly to defend my reputation. But something stopped me, a memory of Benjamin Franklin's approach to handling a critic who had attacked him viciously in print. Instead of fighting back, Franklin had done something unexpected that transformed his enemy into a lifelong friend. I decided to try Franklin's approach with Dr. Harrison. Instead of defending myself or arguing against his criticisms, I wrote him a respectful letter acknowledging that his concerns came from genuine expertise and dedication to educational excellence. I asked if he would be willing to share his insights about effective teaching methods, as I was always eager to learn from someone with his extensive experience and reputation. Dr. Harrison was so surprised by my response that he agreed to meet with me. During our conversation, I listened carefully to his criticisms and found genuine value in several of his points. More importantly, I discovered that his attacks on my methods were rooted in sincere concern about maintaining educational standards, not personal animosity toward me. By the end of our meeting, Dr. Harrison had not only stopped criticizing my work, but had offered to collaborate on improving my curriculum. Within 6 months, he had become one of my strongest advocates, publicly, praising the very methods he had once attacked. The critic who had threatened to damage my reputation had become the supporter whose endorsement enhanced it beyond what I could have achieved alone. This experience taught me that criticism often contains valuable information disguised as attack. When someone criticizes you, they're usually revealing their values, standards, and concerns rather than just finding fault. If you can look past the hostile delivery to find the constructive core, you often discover insights that can genuinely improve your approach. I learned that critics become champions when they feel heard, respected, and valued for their expertise. Dr. Harrison's criticism had come from a place of caring about education quality. When I acknowledged his expertise and genuine concern rather than defending against his attack, he realized I shared his underlying values even if we disagreed about methods. The technique requires genuine humility and curiosity about what critics might be seeing that you've missed. Instead of asking, "How can I prove them wrong?" the question becomes, "What might they be right about that I haven't considered?" This shift from defensive to investigative completely changes the dynamic of the interaction. I began applying this principle systematically with other critics and discovered that most harsh criticism stems from unmet expectations or violated values rather than malicious intent. A client who criticized our service delivery was actually expressing frustration about unmet deadlines that affected their own reputation. A colleague who attacked my presentation style was concerned about maintaining professional standards in our field. The key insight is that people become invested in your success once they feel they've contributed to improving it. When you genuinely implement suggestions from critics, or at least seriously consider them, those critics develop ownership of your improvement and want to see you succeed with their contributions. I learned to respond to criticism with curiosity, rather than defensiveness. That's an interesting perspective. Can you help me understand what you're seeing that concerns you? Or, I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. What would you suggest as a better approach? These responses transform adversarial exchanges into collaborative problem-solving. The high psychological foundation is rooted in fundamental human needs for significance and contribution. Critics invest emotional energy in finding fault because they care about the standards in question. When you acknowledge their investment and invite their contribution to solutions, you're honoring that energy rather than fighting against it. I discovered that public acknowledgement of critics' contributions amplifies the transformation effect. When Dr. Harrison heard me credit his insights during subsequent presentations, he became even more invested in my success and more vocal in his support. The former critic became a powerful advocate because he felt genuinely valued for his expertise. The technique works even with critics whose motivations seem purely negative. I once faced a competitor who was spreading false information about my programs. Instead of responding defensively, I reached out privately to acknowledge his success in our field and ask for his professional insights about industry challenges. His attacks stopped completely, and he eventually referred clients to me. The most remarkable discovery was that critics often become more valuable supporters than people who never questioned your approach. Because they've examined your work critically, their eventual endorsement carries more credibility than praise from those who supported you from the beginning. This principle transformed my understanding of conflict from something to avoid or win to something that could strengthen relationships and improve outcomes. The most influential people don't eliminate criticism. They transform critics into collaborators by finding the constructive intent behind negative feedback. In a world where most people respond to criticism with defensiveness or counterattack, the person who responds with genuine curiosity and appreciation becomes extraordinarily disarming and influential. They don't just survive criticism, they use it as a catalyst for building stronger relationships and achieving better results. As I reflect on a lifetime dedicated to understanding and teaching the principles of human relations, I am constantly amazed by the ripple effects that transformed relationships create throughout families, organizations, and entire communities. The most profound lesson I've learned is that when you master these principles and begin applying them consistently, you don't just change your own life. You become a catalyst for transformation that extends far beyond anything you could imagine. I have received thousands of letters over the years from people whose lives were revolutionized by applying these relationship principles, but what moves me most deeply are the stories about how their transformation affected others. A manager who learned to appreciate his employees found that they began treating customers better, which improved the entire company's reputation. A mother who started showing genuine interest in her teenager's thoughts discovered that her child began communicating more openly with teachers and friends. A salesman who mastered the art of seeing things from customers' perspectives found that his clients began referring their friends and colleagues. This multiplication effect reveals something profound about human nature. When people experience genuine appreciation, understanding, and respect, they naturally want to share these experiences with others. They become ambassadors for the very principles that transformed their own relationships. You don't just improve one relationship at a time. You create expanding circles of positive influence that touch lives you may never know about. I think about the business executive who wrote to tell me that learning to admit his mistakes immediately had not only saved his career, but had created a culture of honesty and continuous improvement throughout his organization. His willingness to be vulnerable and accountable had given others permission to be honest about their own errors, leading to faster problem-solving and innovation. One person's commitment to authentic relationship principles had transformed an entire corporate culture. Or the teacher who discovered the power of making others feel important and began applying this principle with struggling students. Not only did their academic performance improve, but these students began showing more respect and encouragement toward their classmates. The positive atmosphere in her classroom spread throughout the school as other teachers noticed and began adopting similar approaches. A single educator's commitment to human dignity had elevated an entire learning environment. These stories teach us that relationship mastery is not a personal achievement to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared through daily interactions. When you consistently apply these principles, remembering names, showing genuine interest, appealing to noble motives, being sympathetic to others' ideas, you model a way of being that others want to emulate and experience in their own relationships. But this legacy thinking also carries responsibility. Once you understand how to build genuine connections, influence others positively, and transform conflicts into collaborations, you have an obligation to use these abilities for the benefit of others rather than mere personal gain. The principles work because they honor human dignity and bring out the best in people. When used manipulatively or selfishly, they lose their power and can actually damage the relationships they're meant to strengthen. I challenge you to think beyond your immediate relationship goals to the broader impact you want to have on the world around you. How might your family dynamic change if you consistently applied the principle of appealing to noble motives? What might happen in your workplace if you became known as someone who genuinely sees things from others' perspectives? How could your community be different if you were a person who transforms critics into champions and helps others feel genuinely important? The revolution begins with a simple but profound shift in focus, from trying to get what you want from relationships to becoming the kind of person others want to be in relationship with. When you make this shift, everything changes. People are drawn to your authenticity, trust your intentions, and want to support your success because they feel valued and understood in your presence. This doesn't mean becoming a people pleaser or abandoning your own needs and goals. It means pursuing those goals through approaches that simultaneously benefit others and strengthen relationships. It means building influence through contribution rather than manipulation, achieving success through collaboration rather than competition, and creating the kind of legacy that lives on in the improved relationships of everyone you touch. As you begin implementing these principles in your daily life, remember that small, consistent applications create more transformation than dramatic, sporadic efforts. Choose one principle each week and focus on mastering it through conscious practice. Notice not just how others respond differently to you, but how you begin to feel differently about yourself and your relationships. The ultimate measure of your relationship revolution won't be the personal benefits you gain, though those will be substantial. It will be the positive changes you create in others, the confidence you help build, the conflicts you help resolve, the collaboration you help foster, the dignity you help restore. When you master the art of human relations, you become a force for good that extends far beyond your own life and continues through all the relationships you've helped transform. Your legacy lives not in what you accumulate for yourself, but in what you contribute to others. The principles I've shared with you have the power to create that kind of lasting, meaningful impact. The question now is not whether these principles work, it's whether you'll commit to working with them consistently enough to revolutionize your relationships and, through them, your entire life. The revolution begins with your very next human interaction. Make it count.